Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story tells about the main character named Isabella, who was in a rather dark situation. However, the whole story begins with one city meeting, where many local residents gathered to see the saint in person. They greeted and congratulated the lady whose name was Ultia Miraxel. She was the saint of the Sidonian Empire. The two clergymen who were standing behind her began to talk, and one of them said that the saints of their time had become simply beauties. His friend laughed and said that, moreover, he had heard that this girl was stronger than the previous saint. So they were very happy with the fact that their country was now in safe hands, which meant that they had nothing to fear anymore. At that very moment, the saint was upstairs. She went to the balcony and began to pray. She, as trusted by God, swore that she would continue to pray for the happiness of all her people. As soon as the girl said these words, applause, joyful shouts, and firecrackers were immediately heard. People began to celebrate this event. But at that very moment, another girl was standing near the window, who was the main character of this story, Isabella Miraxel. She was the saint's sister. By the time Ulcha returned home, her parents immediately greeted her and began congratulating her on her new status. The mother happily hugged her daughter and said that she was incredibly proud that they had such a wonderful daughter like her. Ultia herself hugged her parents, saying that in order to thank them for everything they had done for her, she was going to try her best to live up to their expectations. This joyful picture was interrupted by the fact that the girl noticed Isabella, who was standing to the side and did not even approach them. She was very happy to see the girl, so she ran to her, asking if she even imagined that their father would be throwing a party in a few days to celebrate this greatest event. With hope in her voice, the newly minted saint asked if her sister would come. But as soon as Isabella saw the angry looks of her parents, she immediately realized that she should answer. No matter how hard it was for the girl, she hung her head, asked her sister for forgiveness, and said that she was not feeling well. She had to quickly come up with a reason so that Ultia wouldn't suspect anything, so she still refused. As soon as the girl heard this, she of course became upset. And Isabella, meanwhile, decided to simply leave so as not to hurt herself even more. As she walked through the estate, she heard joyful conversations all the time. Aristocrats who admired her sister and talked about how wonderful and excellent she was. People also said that she was the one who enjoyed the great fame of the Miraxel family. And they also thought that the most important thing was that rumors about her worthless older sister Isabel should not be spread under any circumstances. As the girl passed by them, she cried. Even though all these aristocrats saw her tears, she understood everything perfectly. No matter how much Ultia respected her older sister, she still remained a useless thing in that family. The girl ran as fast as she could along the corridors in order to return to her room as quickly as possible and simply lock herself there. But she also understood that in that world, there was only one person who believed in her true abilities and was always on her side. In fact, when the eldest daughter was born into the Count's family, no one felt any special love or affection for her. In the eyes of the parents, there was always only a spark of joy that their youngest daughter had acquired the power of the saint. But they treated the eldest as an empty space that did not exist at all. Because of this whole situation, Isabella at some point even stopped seeing the meaning of her life. But one day, on a mysterious day, she, walking through the market to buy an apple, received a real miracle for herself. The girl met a small child on the road. Sitting down next to him, she immediately asked him with concern what was wrong with him, and this child said in a quiet, hoarse voice that he wanted to eat. Isabella was always a kind soul, so she happily handed him a piece of cookie. She also said that it was only a little, but still better than nothing. And as soon as the girl took it out of her pocket and held it out forward, this child immediately snatched it from her hands and began to stuff it entirely into his mouth, almost without chewing. This made Isabella very sad, because even though she lived in the royal capital, there were many abandoned and homeless children in that place. The child, as soon as he finished eating, immediately took her hands and with a smile on his face said that it was very tasty, and also thanked the girl for such generosity. After that, he laughed happily. Isabella stayed there for a while to talk to him and so that he would not feel lonely. She asked him what his name was. The guy said his name was Raven. Then Isabella asked if he would come with her so she could take him to a better place than an alley. So she protected this poor boy, and they were actually even similar because they were both treated like nothing. They couldn't rely on anyone in this big world, so they could barely get through each day. However, Raven eventually became her reason to live. And from then on, Isabella lived days that were like a dream. Even though they were not blood relatives, she always felt as if he was her precious child. One day, when they were walking in the meadow once again, the boy made a beautiful wreath of flowers and other plants for Isabella. When he gave it to her, he said that when he grows up, he will definitely feed her the most delicious food in the world, so he would like her to always stay by his side so that he can fulfill his dream. Isabella, smiling, then replied that, of course, she would always be by his side. But even though the girl was raising this orphan, even this had its limits. So Isabella always dreamed that her power as a saint would also manifest, and it would help her a lot. However, at that moment for the girl, it all sounded, of course, like a fairy tale. She looked at the boy and even thought that perhaps her younger sister would support her in this difficult upbringing of a child. But this was not accurate information, because Raymond was still little, so she decided not to dwell on it and really promised the boy that she would always stay close to him. At that moment, she truly believed that she would definitely be able to fulfill this promise and make Raven happy. And then one day Isabella's dream came true. She met her sister and said that she had acquired the power of the saint. The girl was incredibly happy then and said with a smile on her face that now she too could run for office and help people with it. Of course, Ultia, hearing about this, was not very happy, because candidates for saints are those women who have the power of a saint. And from a very large number of women, the saint chooses the one who has the most powerful force of all. This is all being done to give hope to the country that everything can be solved and that the saint can guide them all on the right path. Isabella at that moment ran to her sister and, hugging her, said that it was all thanks to her, because the girl inspired her, and now she also had this power. However, the younger sister was not so happy about this. She tried not to show it, but she had already begun to answer Isabella distantly. Ultia took it from her hands with her palm, said that she was very glad to hear this, and also said that she had prepared a gift for her in such a case. So she asked her to wait a little. Isabella left, and in fact she had not yet realized the fact that the situation was about to take a very bad turn. The girl could not even imagine that when she told her sister about all her joys, she would receive a big blow in the back. Some time had passed since she had confessed to Ultia, and now she was lying on the floor of a dark attic, not understanding why her saint power was fading. Then her younger sister came to her and asked her for forgiveness, but said that she didn't really intend to do it, but she just had to. Of course, Isabella could not have imagined then that the once kind Ultia would become such a treacherous girl and go against her own sister. The girl explained that she simply had no choice. After all, Isabella had acquired the power of the saint, and that was why she believed that she would have to die. Ultia came closer to her, saying that there should not be a more magnanimous person in this world than herself. The girl also explained that the bracelet she gave Isabella as a gift after the good news was actually a cursed decoration that kept her power inside. Ultia, smiling slyly, said that no matter how much she looked, she still noticed how well it suited Isabella. She also said in a quiet voice that her sister had helped her incredibly by telling her first about the appearance of this force. As soon as the girl heard about this, she was shocked. She could not even imagine that she stopped using her magic because of her sister. But Ultia continued her monologue and said that she thought Isabella needed to know how grateful she was to her for this. And the girl also said that she didn't know that her sister could hide such a wonderful gem. So she asked for forgiveness for doing this right before her death. But at that moment, she turned towards the door and told him to come in. Then the doors to the attic opened, and a man in a robe brought in a little boy whose eyes were bandaged so that he could not see anything. The boy was constantly resisting and asking to be let go, and also screaming. As soon as Isabella saw him, she immediately recognized him. It was Raven, and she asked her sister in a trembling voice why she was doing all this at all. But Ultia ignored her question and said that she was very glad that they were together again now, because it was so wonderful. The boy continued to scream and struggle at this point, calling Isabella's name and asking if she was in the room too. Then Bella turned to her sister in a cold, distant voice and asked her to stop teasing her, and also said that she would not forgive her if she touched that baby with even a finger. Ultia looked at her older sister, smiled slyly, and said that she definitely didn't have to worry about that. She removed the boy's bandage and said that her house would now be hers and the jewels would look good on her beautiful fair skin. Ultia was sure of it. She hugged poor Raven and said that she couldn't even wish for such a thing. Then the girl turned to the boy directly and asked why he didn't take a closer look, since Isabella was facing a truly terrible end to her life. The girl said that she was a sinner who had deceived everyone, so prison, in her opinion, was her merit. As soon as the guy heard this, he immediately got scared. He turned to this terrible aunt and asked what she was going to do with Bella, and also said that he would not let her be harmed. Ultia didn't answer him. She just made a sign to the man who brought the boy that it was time to act, and he immediately took out his sword and began to walk straight towards Isabella. The girl was not actually afraid of death. She just did not want to leave this child alone, and also for him to see this terrible sight. So, turning to Ray, she told him to immediately close his eyes. At that moment, the boy continued to scream. There were tears in his eyes. He was simply hysterical and was reaching out with his hands towards Isabella, but it was all useless, because her younger sister was holding him very tightly. At that moment, a terrible sight occurred. This man had already reached the girl and cut her stomach. There was a lot of blood around, and Isabella died on the spot instantly. For a long time there was darkness in her consciousness, but after that she seemed to separate her soul from her dead body and could see the picture that took place after her death. The girl watched as Ray leaned over her cold body and asked her to open her eyes. He was, of course, crying. She felt incredibly sorry for this precious child because he was hysterical, hugging her dead body. How he wanted her to come back to life, but it was already impossible to do. Isabella fell to her knees in the total darkness that was around her and realized that she had failed very badly. Even if her life with Ray was cut short, she knew that the most important thing was for him to be happy. However, her hope had already been completely shattered after her own sister killed her. But she didn't understand why it all happened this way. Why did Isabella go and trust Ultia in such an important matter? She thought that perhaps it was because she had acquired the power of a saint, or because she had acquired a person who was dear to her and who could be manipulated very easily. But in the end, Isabella came to one conclusion. Her death, the danger to the life of a little boy, all this was the fault of her evil sister. At that moment, the girl thought that if she suddenly somehow got another chance at life, then she was going to show Ultia what despair meant. And the girl was going to do it, and even though it would most likely make her a villain, she was going to get revenge on her little sister for what she had done. Isabella died at the hands of Ultia. Or, to be more precise, she should have. But as soon as she opened her eyes, she noticed that she was alive, and did not understand how this was even possible. The girl, of course, thought that all this was just a dream that she had, but as soon as she woke up in the body, she realized that it was not so. Isabella didn't know why, but time had somehow turned back, and she also felt like she should now be grateful for this development. And all this is because she was given a good opportunity to fix everything in her life and not get the same meager ending as in the previous one. As soon as she approached the mirror and saw her appearance, she realized that she had returned to that day when she received the power of the saint. Last time, of course, Isabella, as soon as she found out about it, immediately went to her sister to tell her about it. However, now that she didn't have the bracelet on her arm to restrain her magical abilities, Isabella might even be able to do something. While the girl was thinking about this, there was a knock on her door and the maid came in. She immediately looked in that direction and asked what had happened. The maid bowed, greeted the girl, and said in a quiet voice that the master was inviting her to a family meal. After that, she bowed and went out the door, closing it behind her, and Isabella, hearing that she was invited to a meal with the family, immediately understood everything. If the girl showed her abilities on this day, it means that something else must happen. So she will have to go there anyway, no matter how much she doesn't want to. But before going downstairs, she decided to properly make herself pretty, so she took out various cosmetic accessories to tidy up her face and body. Isabella sat down at the dressing table. She was determined, and also realized that she would be using all these feminine accessories for the first time. So she was a little scared because of this. Well, after some time, she finished tidying herself up and finally went downstairs for that very family meal. As soon as she entered, she immediately made a curtsy and, addressing the entire family, asked for forgiveness for being a little late. And her father at that moment sighed heavily, said that she was taking a very long time, but when she was called, she should immediately come down and come. But after he looked at his eldest daughter, seeing her beautiful outfit and appearance, he immediately fell silent, completely forgetting what he wanted to say. Isabella's mother and sister also looked at her and were incredibly surprised. However, at that moment the girl, as if nothing had happened, approached them, and sitting down at the table, asked what had happened, because she did not understand why they had such surprised expressions on their faces, and also suggested that they start eating because she was terribly hungry. The father, who was still under the impression, agreed with her, but after that he did not utter a single word. Meanwhile, Isabella began to study the faces of her relatives and realized that it was much more interesting when you could see a good and immediate effect. After this, they waited for some time, and when the food was brought out, the father turned to Ulcia, saying that he would like to hear what she wanted to tell them all. The girl, wiping her mouth with a napkin, immediately smiled and said that she had almost forgotten why she had gathered them together. But then, looking at her parents, she said that she was marrying the son of Duke Greisel Lorenzo. When the parents heard this, they were not particularly surprised, because they had long ago guessed that this would most likely happen, so they began to congratulate their daughter and smile. Meanwhile, Isabella began to bang her cutlery loudly on her plate, continuing to eat. Everyone present was immediately surprised by such behavior. The younger sister only looked at the girl and could not understand why there was no reaction from her. Her father soon could not stand such inappropriate behavior, and turning to Isabella, he said that Ulcia had told them important news, so he asked her to stop eating already and listen carefully to her sister. The girl was silent for a while and only looked at her father with great hatred in her eyes. After she had chewed everything that was in her mouth, she finally spoke. Isabella said that she just hadn't eaten such a luxurious meal in a long time, so she couldn't just stop. Ulcia, hearing about this, immediately laughed and, asking her for forgiveness, asked if she remembered correctly that the girl was quite close to Lorenzo. She also said that it is quite natural in such a case that the girl cannot congratulate her. Their mother got very angry at this point. She turned to Ulcia and said that the girl shouldn't apologize at all, because the Duke's son chose her, and that's the most important thing. They poured themselves some more wine and immediately began to congratulate her on this wonderful news. But Isabella, meanwhile, was thinking about the fact that Lorenzo had really been in her life for quite a long time. In fact, Lorenzo Greisel was her childhood friend, who was always very kind to the girl. Her little sister was always surrounded by crowds of friends who wanted to hang out and play with her. And of all of them, only Lorenzo treated his sisters equally. He always called her to play with them when Isabella was left completely alone. This is what the girl's entire past was like. It was not at all filled with happiness, love, and respect. But even after so many years, when Isabella had already grown up and had something to be proud of, the family still did not feel any special love or gratitude towards her. But as expected, the girl heard the announcement of Ulcia's engagement. Of course, in her past life, she only felt despair from hearing it. But now she knew that everything would be different, so she treated the news she heard differently. After a short silence, Isabella turned to them all and said that she had something to talk about. As soon as Ulcia heard about this, she was immediately surprised, and the girl at that moment declared in front of everyone that she also had the power of a saint. And as soon as all the family members heard about this, they immediately began to look at Isabella in surprise and simply could not believe that this was really true. The girl, meanwhile, made a puzzled expression and asked what had happened, since they had always wanted her to have power too, and asked why they weren't congratulating her in that case. After a rather long and drawn-out silence, her mother turned to her and said that if the person she liked did not choose her, it did not mean that she should despair. She also said that she had never heard of a saint's power appearing at such a late age, so she asked her to stop making things up. Her father, meanwhile, sighed heavily and said that she would do well to refrain from words and actions that could destroy the dignity of their family. Of course, Isabella knew perfectly well that her parents would not listen to what she told them, so from then on, she stopped having any hopes. Isabella suddenly slammed her hands on the table and asked if this meant that they had lied to her about this too. However, at that moment, the girl began to use her magical power, and her parents certainly did not like it, because they began to hear some screams and terrible sounds inside their heads. Isabella's mother began to scream loudly because of this horror, and the girl meanwhile laughed loudly as if she enjoyed the suffering of her family. When it was finally over, her father started yelling at Isabella and asked if she was in her right mind, and if it was really her doing. But the girl, only smiling smugly, said that this was proof of the manifestation of her holy power and that this energy could not only heal people. She also asked that they just not say that they did not know about it. In fact, it was quite known that the power of the saint was the usual ability to heal people. However, in reality, this power is quite omnipotent. If a person is strong enough, he can use the ability not only for healing. And when Isabella used her magical energy, she realized that her power was much more powerful than her sister's. That's exactly why she gave the girl that cursed bracelet. At that moment, Isabella stood up and started to leave, while everyone in the room was shocked. And before she went out the door, she said that if they decided to congratulate her, they could come. She would be happy to wait for them at her place. After she found herself in the corridor, she smiled smugly, because she really liked the sight in which she could see those horrified faces of her parents. Naturally, this was not the end, but only the beginning of her great plan, which she had managed to come up with. Then suddenly she felt someone appear behind her. She immediately realized that it was her sister Ultia and asked if she really needed something. The girl was not at all surprised, because she knew perfectly well that she would come. Because among the candidates of the saints, they choose the girl whose power is the most powerful of all. And because in their time there was no one who would use power only for healing, they chose Ultia as the saint, who had comparatively more energy. And that's why Isabella was interested in what would happen if she turned out to be stronger than her sister. Meanwhile, Ultia came closer to her and said that she was very surprised by what happened, so she couldn't say anything. But now she would like to congratulate her with all her heart and soul and give her one gift. At this point, Isabella suddenly interrupted her and asked for forgiveness for this, but first suggested that they go inside her room. As soon as they were inside, the girl immediately sat down on the couch and invited her sister to sit next to her, and then asked what she had said about the gift. At that moment, Ultia, smiling smugly, handed her a small box, saying that she would like to congratulate her on the fact that she now also had magical abilities. As soon as Isabella opened the box and saw the shiny gold bracelet inside, she immediately realized that everything was happening exactly as she thought. This bracelet wasn't even new at all, which meant that her sister had probably tried to use it on other candidates as well. Ultia, seeing her expression, immediately said that he was handsome, and also added that it was a sign of reconciliation as her apology for what happened. Isabella, smiling, said that it was indeed very beautiful. Meanwhile, her sister took it in her hands and offered to put it on the girl, and also asked her to stretch out her hand. The girl had a very good thought in her head, so stretching her hand forward, she quickly pulled it back when Ultia almost secured the bracelet on her wrist. Thus, the decoration flew somewhere down. As soon as the girl saw this, she immediately got scared and asked what she was doing. Isabella, meanwhile smiling, asked what it was like, what she was doing, and also said that she was simply fencing herself off from a bad thing that did not carry any benefit in itself. Her sister, meanwhile, bent over the bracelet and said that she did not understand why it was a bad thing, because it was just a gift. She also said that she could not believe that Isabella had done this to her. But the girl was now very bold and brave, so, coming closer to her sister, she asked if this gift was really simple. Seeing Ultia's surprised expression, she asked the girl to put on the jewelry immediately in that case, and at the same time tell her what effect it had. Of course, the younger sister was very scared when she heard this, because the bracelet really was not simple, and it did not bode well. Isabella, meanwhile, continued to speak and said that she saw right through her devilish soul and hastened to upset her, because her power as a girl certainly could not be sealed. She also came closer to her and, grabbing her hand, which had the bracelet, asked if she was afraid of her own sister. But then she replied that it was quite obvious, because she was the one who possessed a power that was much more powerful than Ultia's. After that, she pushed her so that the girl fell to the ground, and said that she did not even want to know her anymore. Isabella stood over her, head held high, not saying another word. She wasn't going to fall for that hook a second time, so she was finally able to fight back. After that, she said goodbye to her sister because she knew that she still needed to meet her dear Raven. In reality, Raven Denham Ayleston was a child born to a servant and the Emperor of Sidonia. He was sent to another palace because the queen could not accept him. And in the other palace, the little crown prince was trying to survive with all his might, so when they first met, Raven looked very alienated. Of course, Isabella never imagined that he might end up being a prince, but when she found out about it, she was truly surprised. When her saint power manifested, they were already familiar with Raven. So at the time she was reborn, he should have already been in that palace. Without thinking twice, Isabella immediately asked to assemble a carriage for her, because she had to go to him immediately. And so, while the girl was driving, she accidentally remembered the expression on his face as he watched her death, and because of this she felt even sadder. Having collected her thoughts, she even promised herself that this time she would never hurt him, but would try in every way to do everything for his happiness. There wasn't even a single guard near the palace where the little boy lived. The royal family's attitude towards Raven could be judged by the fact that he was placed in a separate, unguarded area. And besides, this territory was in the very corner of the imperial castle, but even the royal family itself did not conduct it. So, of course, no one ever noticed Isabella's penetration. As soon as the girl entered the estate, she immediately looked around and realized that it had already been 3 years since they met him, and they had not even managed to finish cleaning up to the end. She ran straight to the room where Ray was supposed to be, and just the thought of him gave her butterflies in her stomach because she really wanted to meet him. The girl missed him so much, and she really wanted to know if he was safe and if everything was okay with this beautiful boy. So without even knocking, she burst into the room where he was. But opening the door, Isabella was very surprised because this room was completely empty and no one responded to her words. The girl walked around the room, but Ray was not there. Then she looked at the chest of drawers and noticed that his clothes were also missing. There were no glasses around, no books he had read, not even the wreath they had made with him. There was absolutely no trace of Ray in the room. You, as soon as she thought about it, were horrified, so you couldn't even stand on your feet, but fell to your knees. The girl couldn't believe that he wasn't in this room. She thought that maybe he was in another one, but the thought also crept into her head that he might have left the city. But if this was really the case, then Isabella had no choice but to simply accept the fact. And all because she understood that at that time he had a big scar from the life he had lived before. After some time, Isabella went around absolutely all the places where he could be, but still could not find Ray. She supposed that perhaps turning back time had saved her from meeting Raven as well. But in that case, she didn't know what to do at all. For Isabella, along with her sister, in that case it no longer made any sense. But at that moment, when she was passing by some residents, she suddenly heard 2 men reading a newspaper and talking about something. One asked if he had seen the terrible news. The other said that he had, and that the man was quite frightening, so it was no wonder that they even wrote about him in the newspaper. The guy also told his friend that he had killed all the members of the royal family, ascended to the throne, and was now going to conquer the neighboring country in less than a few months. As soon as Isabella heard about this, she immediately became interested. She ran up to the men and snatched the newspaper from them. One of the guys, smiling, said that he was just like some kind of bloody emperor. But as soon as the girl snatched the newspaper, he immediately stopped and began to swear at her. She, meanwhile, looking through the headlines, threw them a few coins with her eyes as a sign of payment for this newspaper and ran away from prying eyes. Her hands were actually shaking. Then she saw the portrait, and the headline of the newspaper said that the Emperor of the Ceylon Empire, Raven, had returned to the country with full control over the neighboring kingdom of Muhab. The girl simply could not believe that it was really Ray, and that he had grown so much, and even more so that he had begun to conquer the world. Isabella assumed that perhaps she was confusing him with someone else. However, her intuition had never failed her, so she was absolutely sure that it was him. This was exactly the same Raven she had been looking for so long. So the girl went to collect detailed information in order to understand what was what. And having collected the information, she still managed to put the puzzle together. At that time, Rayvon was 23 years old, and he was 5 years older than the girl. 6 months ago, he killed his entire royal family and eventually ascended to the throne. He became feared as a ruthless and merciless emperor, both within the empire and beyond. Because of the great changes he made after his accession, unrest began, which led to much bloodshed. Therefore, Isabella concluded that she had come to another world, which was different from the past. But at the same time, there were the same people here, and events were intertwined. She continued to look at this newspaper and was very surprised, because she had never seen Ray with such a cold expression on his face in her life. Of course, it was very difficult to deny that it was not him, because they had exactly the same names. However, if the girl admitted that that little Ray was him, then all the memories they had created together would simply disappear. So Isabella came to the conclusion that she must definitely check this information. After all, if she does not do this, then her second life will not begin the way she wanted. Immediately after that, she went to the estate and then suddenly realized that she had absolutely no idea what she was doing. In her heart, she knew very well that if she came to that palace again, she would not see Rayvon there. But at that moment, she approached the threshold of the palace and saw a man lying down. Her heart suddenly started beating even faster. She came closer to this guy and thought that maybe this person was Ray. When she looked more closely at his face, which was quite adult, she actually had a memory from the past of how she slept with him in the same bed. She really loved this guy, so she spoke to him in a quiet voice to wake him up and talk. Despite the fact that this guy is no longer little, however, at that moment, when he was lying like this with his eyes closed, she immediately remembered that little boy whom she had once found many years ago. Now Isabella was completely sure that it was really him. She didn't know why he suddenly became older than her and even took the throne, but she felt better because she finally saw him. Isabella began to carefully examine him from head to toe and noticed quite large bruises under his eyes, so she concluded that he was sleeping very poorly. At that moment, in order to heal the man, she pulled her palm, in which magic was already concentrated. But at the moment when she wanted to touch her forehead, Ray suddenly grabbed her hand and, pulling the girl closer to him, asked who she was. Isabella looked at him in surprise. She didn't understand why he was so strict with her, but she was also surprised by how much this guy had grown. The man completely ignored her words. He asked what she had just tried to do and looked at her without taking his eyes off her. Isabella didn't answer at that moment. She just stood there with an imperturbable expression on her face and remained silent. The guy waited for a while and then asked in a surprised voice, "Can't she really answer?" There was silence after this question. He let go of her hand and said that in that case he would wait until she finally opened her mouth. At that moment, Isabella understood perfectly well that the memory of her had completely disappeared from his head. She, as a person, no longer existed for Ray. After some time, she collected her feelings and, standing up, bowed, saying that she apologized for not introducing herself right away, so she would like to correct her mistake. After that, she gave her name and also said that she was the eldest daughter of the Miraxel family. As soon as the man heard about this, he was very surprised. But then he asked what she was trying to do with him in that case. Isabella, still bowing before him, replied in a quiet voice that she had tried to heal him. Upon hearing this, the guy, of course, became even more indignant and asked what it meant. And she immediately replied that she had shown the power of the saint. He looked rather tired, so she decided to help him at least a little. Isabella also asked him for forgiveness for trying to touch him without his permission. She really was very sorry. At this point, Ray smiled happily and said that in that case, he had one more question. As soon as she heard this, she immediately looked at him. And after a short dramatic pause, Ray asked, "Why did she come to this place anyway?" As soon as she heard these words, she immediately began to worry a little. The guy, in turn, replied that only one knight could enter this place, so he would like to know for what purpose she had entered it. Isabella, in the same quiet voice, asked him for forgiveness and said that she had business with the royal family, but she had lost her way and therefore wandered into this estate. She tried to keep a calm expression on her face so that the blood emperor who sat in front of her would not suspect anything. At that moment, she also became a little scared, because he might simply not listen to her and kill her, without asking any more questions. But at that moment, Ray suddenly shouted and said that he would give her one chance. If she wanted him to believe her, she had to heal one wound in him. At that moment, the guy pulled the sleeve of his shirt up and pointed to a huge scratch that was halfway down his arm. He explained that he had recently been injured in the war and was going to leave things as they were because calling all the potential saints would be too much of a hassle. But since the saint had decided to appear right in front of him, he decided to take advantage of this chance and at the same time check her words. As soon as Isabella saw this injury, her heart immediately began to ache because her dear boy was injured. So, without thinking twice, she activated her abilities and began to heal her. She used quite a lot of force to ensure that not a single trace of this wound remained, and also to ensure that he did not suffer from pain. At this point, Ray stood completely still and just watched this process. At first, it surprised him a little, but soon he got used to it and endured the entire procedure. After the girl removed her hands, she asked if he was okay and if his wound had healed. At that moment, the guy began to carefully examine his hand, and Isabella asked if everything was okay, because the expression on his face was rather strange. Then Ray, looking at her with danger and even disgust, asked what she had just done. The girl was surprised by his words, because he himself asked to heal his wound, but she decided to repeat herself and said that she fulfilled his request. As soon as he heard these words, he immediately came closer to Isabella and grabbed her in his arms. The girl was so shocked that at first she did not even understand what was happening. But as soon as she felt her body lift off the ground and Ray run towards the estate, she was surprised. Soon the man ran into his room. He placed her next to the bed and lay down on her, asking her to heal another wound. The girl was surprised and immediately asked what he meant. Ray, looking at her, replied that as she said, he was really very tired, so he couldn't even sleep. So he wanted her to heal him and make him finally fall asleep. Isabella replied in a trembling voice that she was certainly not against it, but asked if he was sure he wanted it, since she would see him sleeping. Ray, meanwhile, had already turned on his side and said that if she suddenly tried to do something to him, he would destroy her entire family. So she didn't have to worry. The girl didn't answer him, moved away, and began to approach him closer. Of course, for her, all this was not a threat at all, because she hated her family with all her soul, but still, she didn't want to cause him any harm, so she just asked. In a quiet voice, she asked if he was sure he didn't mind, and also if she could start already. Ray immediately answered that he could. Then Isabella asked for his hand, saying that in this way she could put her power into him. The man, without even turning around, extended his palm. Then she touched it and began to pour energy into him. But at that moment, she was also incredibly sad, because she understood that he was apparently in a difficult situation, that he had to trust a stranger. Some time passed from that moment, and finally the guy was able to fall asleep. Then, she came closer to him, and stroking his head, asked that her sweet child have good dreams. Some time passed from that moment, and Isabella kept thinking about how he fell asleep so quickly that she didn't even have time to blink. But the girl also didn't notice how she fell asleep herself. As soon as Isabella began to open her eyes, she saw his beautiful lavender-colored pupils, which were directed right at her. Her hand was on his, and she realized pretty quickly that it shouldn't be like that. So, moving away from the man, she asked how he was feeling, and also wished him a good morning. Ray at this point began to get out of bed and said that he felt pretty good, and Isabella, whose cheeks were flushed, said that it was very good indeed. The man explained at this point that he had been sleeping poorly for quite some time now, and it didn't matter whether he was tired or not. Short periods of sleep could cause him physical and psychological illnesses, and that's why he sent several potential saints to use their healing powers. However, the results were the same for everyone, but with Isabella, it was completely different. He moved closer to the girl and said that for the first time in a long time he was able to sleep longer, so he asked her to continue helping him sleep. As soon as the girl heard this, she became even more embarrassed. She thought about this proposal for some time and soon said her answer. After asking Ray for forgiveness, she said that she could not accept this offer. As soon as he heard this, of course, he did not like it, and he asked why she refused. And the girl, lowering her head down, said that in fact this power appeared to her quite recently, and at that time she was only 18 years old, so she cannot deny that at such an age this power can easily disappear. It is because of this that she cannot bring to light that she can use such an ability. And besides, she has not even told her family anything yet. Of course, none of this was true. She had no intention of working with Ray, precisely on principle. She didn't want to attract the temple's interest in all of this. In fact, all girls who have gained power automatically belong to the temple. In other words, if news of her power reaches the temple, it will definitely make her belong to the Ultiyu kingdom. And all this could lead to her sister starting to put a spoke in her wheel. And what's worse, trying to kill her. However, be that as it may, Isabella also had no intention of publicly declaring her power. She wants everything to remain as it is. Ray, having listened carefully to the girl's position and thought it all over, asked in surprise why she didn't want to announce her abilities. When she didn't answer him, he said that everything was clear, and most likely, it was definitely not appropriate. As soon as she heard about this, she was immediately surprised and asked why. And the man explained that because he also doesn't tell anyone about his insomnia. At that moment, Isabella thought that the emperor also needed to hide all possible weaknesses from the people. And then suddenly, she received a very unexpected offer from him. Smiling slyly, Ray asked Isabella if she wanted to be his girlfriend. Of course, this proposal was very surprising for the girl, but she wondered, does he really want her to become a girl in the sense of a love relationship? But if not, then she would like him to explain. Ray sighed heavily and said that he was going to meet her mostly at night, and if they pretended to date, then naturally people would think they were a couple. Isabella said that she understood everything, but she really understood that if they met at night, then various rumors and gossip could start about Ray, which would definitely affect his reputation. She thought it was a really great idea, but she didn't know if she should even accept this rather risky proposal. Her position was different from all the others. She was neither a concubine nor a queen. To the emperor himself, she was simply a stranger. Isabella believed that even if she settled in the castle as the emperor's woman, there would be people who would neglect her. There was also a high probability that the situation could be similar to the one in the past life. Seeing her hesitation, the man said that her job would only be to come to him at night and make him fall asleep. That's all. Nothing more. Ray explained that forcing her to do more was under-rewarding. Of course, she would also be rewarded for that. As soon as Isabella heard about the reward, she immediately became interested and asked, could she really get anything she wanted? And the man explained that if it was appropriate, then of course he would accept such a request. Isabella at that moment realized that getting a reward was very good, and if she thought carefully, she could get great benefits for herself. Firstly, she could become quite a strong shield for the emperor. Despite their fake relationship, those around them who did not know about it would not be able to openly disdain those whom the emperor had his eye on. In other words, it will become much more difficult to leave, to inflict any attack on your sister as a sign of your envy and caution. And secondly, if Isabella really accepted this offer, then she could end up next to Raven. Of course, the girl understood perfectly well that Ray no longer needed her protection. However, she still did not want to let him out of her sight, and she would also like to see when he finally becomes happy, because unfortunately, in her past life she was unable to achieve this. Even if Isabella began to be underestimated, it was normal. She did not see any problem in it. After all, the main thing is that she will be next to the person she loved all this time. So stretching out her hand forward, she said with a smile on her face that she understood everything and eventually accepted his proposal. Of course, Ray was very surprised at first, because he was absolutely sure that even with a reward the girl would refuse, because it was a really risky offer. But he was glad that this did not happen. And smiling, Isabella shook his hand, saying that she hoped for fruitful cooperation with him. And what was the surprise of all the servants of the house in which Isabella lived when she showed up there with him? They both walked with their heads held high, while the other maids and butlers whispered behind their backs, trying to figure out what had happened. Of course, for Isabella this was no problem at all. However, he had to report her arrival, so before they went to the place where he was leading them, she turned to His Highness and said that she also had one request. Ray looked at the girl suspiciously and told her with just one look to say her request. Then the girl said that she would like him to inform her family on his behalf that she had become his woman and would live in the imperial castle. As soon as he heard about this request, he sighed heavily and said that he would probably have to do it. She immediately thanked him for it. After this, they continued their way in silence, and Isabella was well aware that this request could raise questions about the circumstances under which she should report this to the family. She was absolutely sure that it was because he was not interested in her at all, so she did not ask any additional questions. So she decided to be grateful even for that. And at that moment, as Ray approached his office, his secretary suddenly turned to him and started shouting. The red-haired boy was very unhappy and said he couldn't believe he had gone to that horrible palace again last night. He also said that he should have taken security with him just in case. But at that moment, he noticed the girl who was standing next to his master. After that, he asked Ray who this double was, and he said in a mysterious voice that it was his woman. As soon as the assistant heard about this, he simply froze in place, because he certainly did not expect to hear this from the emperor himself. Isabella, meanwhile, smiling happily, introduced herself and said that she was very pleased to meet him. The guy bowed at that moment and said in a trembling voice that his name was Alan Rupt and that he was the emperor's secretary. But the two of them were no longer listening to him because they opened the doors and went inside, completely ignoring anyone's words. Alan, meanwhile, remained standing in place and still could not believe that the emperor actually had a woman. At this point, Ray turned to the girl and said that he had once not told her about his insomnia, and he had also kept silent about the candidates for saints that he had brought up. As soon as Isabella heard this, she was very surprised and said that it was quite strange for her, because the emperor's secretary is like a right hand, so she asked why he was hiding everything from her. The man was silent for a while, answered this question in a very serious voice, and said that it was all because he was very noisy. After some time, they went even higher, and Ray, opening the room, said that she could use it as her own. But as soon as Isabella went inside, she was very surprised, because this room was simply luxurious and also two-story. She asked in a trembling voice if she could really live in such a wonderful room. And Ray, walking forward a little, explained that she was the most suitable, because his room was right behind the wall. As soon as Isabella heard this, she froze in place, because the emperor's bedroom was located next to hers, and she understood perfectly well that this room was reserved for the empress. She also knew the fact that Ray was still unmarried, but she wasn't sure if she was even allowed to be in such a high-status room. As soon as Isabella became sad and hung her head down, Ray noticed this, and coming closer to her, said that he wanted to tell her something important. After that, in a cold, distant voice, closing the door, he said that he had no love for her, so she should not forget about it under any circumstances. Isabella was surprised by his behavior, but said that she understood it perfectly well and was not going to do anything about it. The girl actually knew that the past Ray and the current one were very different from each other, so she didn't expect him to love her as a girl. Of course, she was also a little sad that she would no longer be able to see that happy smile of his as a child, just as he saw hers. But these were the realities, and she had to come to terms with them. Then Ray, ending the conversation, said that it was very good that she understood everything. So he was going to return to his office. As he was leaving, the man said that if she needed anything, she should ask the nearest maid, and she would definitely help her. Ray also said that he was going to choose a personal servant for her soon, but until then, she could approach anyone. Isabella was a little surprised when he said that she would have a personal servant, but she thanked him for it and escorted the man out of the room. When she went back inside, she looked around and still could not believe that she now had a personal room, which was reserved for the empress and would have her own maid. Therefore, Isabella believed that if you look from the outside, she looked like the emperor's favorite person, for whom he was ready to do anything. The girl also really hoped that this would not cause Ray problems when he was ready to find a real partner. Meanwhile, the man had already returned to his office. Alan immediately came to him and started yelling at the man, asking what all this meant. He did not understand how the emperor could bring to the palace a woman about whom nothing was even known. But Ray, without taking his eyes off the papers, replied that she was the eldest daughter of the Maraxil family. So they did know something. However, his secretary, upon hearing this, was immediately surprised and asked, "Is this really the same family where the saint lives?" Not waiting for an answer, he apologized to him for asking again and shouted, asking, "Is this girl really her older sister?" Alan also responded that he was absolutely sure that she approached him only because the man produces precious stones. In fact, a jeweler is a person who is able to produce precious stones in a world where precious stones are very rare. The jewelry produced by jewelers is known as luxury goods, and these luxury items are very difficult to obtain even for aristocrats. In particular, the jewels of Emperor Raiwan were famous for being inaccessible to almost everyone. Because of this, there were a lot of rumors that if a person has his jewelry, then this person will be absolutely happy his entire life. Alan continued to shout at the emperor and said that if he invited a stranger for fun, then he advises to throw her out and asked the man to choose the concubine who was chosen by the candidates. Ray himself hadn't listened to him for a long time. He looked at his hand and actually thought about the precious stones. The secretary, seeing his expression, began to shout even louder and asked His Highness if he had heard him at all. But at that moment, Ray couldn't stand it at all. He looked at his assistant with a very angry look and said that Isabella was his woman, and no matter what the man says, it won't change anything, so he would advise his secretary to shut her mouth if his tongue is still precious. The man, laughing nervously, said that of course he had crossed the line a little, and then, in turn, asked him to leave his sight. Alan, hearing about this, was very surprised and just stood there looking at the emperor. Ray then started yelling at him even louder and asked, "Are you really deaf?" and also repeated that he should leave immediately. The man was very surprised and alarmed. Then he walked quickly to the door and, closing it behind him, said that he had already left. Out of shock, he stopped in his tracks and thought that it was simply impossible that His Highness would actually acknowledge this girl. So from that moment on, the man decided that he would show the emperor the full essence of Isabella. At this very time, the girl had already drawn a hot bath for herself and had just entered it to take a little rest. She was very glad that she was finally allowed to take a hot bath, because she wanted to get rid of the unpleasant aftertaste from yesterday that remained as soon as possible. But at that moment, the girl suddenly noticed something strange on her hand, and it appeared from the moment she lowered her hand into the water. Looking more closely, she noticed that it was a precious cable and was very surprised, because she did not understand what it was doing on her body at all. The girl immediately tried to remove it from her hand because she was definitely not a jeweler, and it should not have been there. Then suddenly she thought about it and realized that the only jeweler in this estate was Ray. Of course, she only found out who he was several months after meeting him in her past life. One day she was laying out a blanket for them to have a picnic, and suddenly Ray asked her if she liked precious stones. When he heard from Isabella that she, of course, loved them very much, his face simply shone with happiness. A happy smile appeared on his cute little face, and at that moment, he extended his hands to her, in which were the stones. But these stones were not simple. They were precious stones, which horrified Isabella. She immediately asked him in a trembling voice how he had gotten them. The guy was even a little scared of her reaction, but said that he just made them, so he wanted to give them to her. At that moment, Isabella realized that Ray was a jeweler. The boy continued to hold out his hands with stones to her and said that he wanted to give them to her. But before he could even come to his senses, she suddenly ran up to him and began hugging him incredibly tightly, not even paying attention to the fact that all the stones he was holding in his hands flew in different directions. The guy was then very surprised by her sudden change of mood and asked if everything was okay with her. But she, continuing to hug him, asked if he had told anyone that he could do this. Ray pulled away from her and said that it wasn't like that at all. He just told her. Then the girl, smiling, said that it was very good and asked him to promise her something. She told him to never tell anyone about it again. Of course, Ray was very surprised by such a request, but he still promised her to do it. She knew very well at that time that if the aristocrats found out that Raven was a jeweler and knew how to make precious stones, he would face very big troubles. Even Isabella knew that the end of a jeweler left without support could end badly, so he had to keep it a big secret until he came of age. But now that she saw how her past life ended, the girl realized that despite all this, he still did not get the happiest moment in his life. She quickly pushed these thoughts away from herself, because she understood that now it was no secret to anyone that he was a jeweler. So she had absolutely no need to worry about this. She touched what was on her wrist again and realized that the most important thing for her was to find out what kind of stone it was. Looking at it more closely, she noticed that it was the same color as Ray's eyes. At that moment, an interesting question suddenly came to her mind. Had Ray ever had a close relationship with someone? But then she suddenly heard the door open behind her. The girl immediately turned her head to the side and saw Ray, who was covered at the bottom with only one towel. She was very scared when she saw him, and she definitely did not expect this. Her whole face immediately turned red. She pulled the towel she had climbed into the bathroom with even higher and tried to understand why he had suddenly ended up in the bathroom where she was. Then she began to climb out of the bath and, asking his forgiveness, immediately said that she would immediately come out so that he could also take a bath. She immediately thought that most likely there was a misunderstanding between his servants, and that was why such an awkward moment happened. But at the moment when the girl was about to get out, she heard some kind of splash behind her and immediately turned around to see what it was. Then Isabella saw Ray climb on the other side of the tub towards her. This surprised her terribly, and she did not understand why he went into the water, although she was there. Her face turned even redder, and her cheeks began to burn. They sat in complete silence for a while, and Isabella noticed that her path to the exit was blocked. She sat with her head down and thought that she had missed her chance to escape this place and skip this awkward part. In fact, she and Ray used to take baths together. However, it was impossible to do so now because this guy was even older than her, and this was already a violation of personal boundaries. She assumed that he probably did it to add authenticity to their relationship, and she thought it was a pretty good theory. Then she glanced at the man and began to examine his appearance even more. Isabella concluded that Ray had become incredibly mature. Then suddenly their eyes met, and he asked in surprise why she was looking at him like that. The girl immediately looked away from him and said that it was nothing like that. After that, there was silence between them again. When the silence became completely unbearable, Isabella decided to speak to him and, asking for forgiveness, said that she had one question. Ray immediately asked what the question was, and Isabella replied that it had to do with the gemstone. She knew perfectly well that if she wanted to get a hint about what kind of stone was on her wrist, the fastest way would be to simply ask a person who was a jeweler. But despite this, she still thought that it would be better not to show him her stone, because she had never met such people who had a jewel on their wrist. So Isabella decided to just ask about it carefully, but before she could say a word, Ray's voice suddenly came in asking how much she wanted. She immediately asked in surprise what he was talking about, and the man explained that she had probably already decided what the reward would be. And looking straight into her eyes, he smiled and said that whoever received his stone would be able to easily live the rest of his life without worrying about any expenses at all. At that moment, Isabella suggested that perhaps he thought she was trying to extort precious stones from him as a reward, since she had brought up that very topic. Of course, his thoughts were understandable because any person could be drawn to such an enticing little thing. But of course, it didn't work in her case at all. She was about to say something when suddenly his voice was heard again, saying that he could give them to her, but it would still be in exchange for curing his insomnia. Then the girl finally interrupted him and said that this was not what she wanted to tell him at all. She did not need precious stones. She looked at him again with a softer gaze and said that her question was only related to the subject of stones. As soon as Ray heard about this, he immediately pretended that he was not interested at all and asked what she had there. Then Isabella, plucking up her courage, asked if jewelers could make precious stones the color of her eyes. As soon as the guy heard this, he was so surprised that he even just sat and remained silent for a while. Then he cautiously asked the girl what her intention was in suddenly asking about this. Isabella replied with a smile on her face that it was just that his eyes were so beautiful, like stones. That's why she asked about it. Ray didn't answer this. He was silent for a while, and then he said that jewelers cannot create gemstones the color of their eyes. However, they can only do this once in their entire life. This is the phenomenon that occurs when they invoke a miracle. In fact, it will be a wish-fulfilling stone. It is called a miracle stone. A jeweler can make it only when he sincerely wishes for something. However, he cannot do this freely. As soon as Isabella heard about this, she immediately realized that if the whole world knew that there was a wish-fulfilling gem, no one would remain silent about it. But at that moment, she suddenly thought that most likely the stone that appeared on her wrist was precisely this miracle stone. At that moment, Isabella suddenly remembered a moment from the past when he, as a little boy, explained this whole structure to her and said that this was why he couldn't give her only the purple stone. He was incredibly sorry to say this, and so he even asked her for forgiveness. But she replied that there was nothing terrible about it because she said that it was absolutely not important to her, so he could not worry about it.